Dr. Elias Carter had always prided himself on his work. A leading virologist at the Advanced Pathogen Research Facility in Geneva, he was no stranger to dangerous experiments. But on that fateful night, as he stood in his sterile lab, he had no idea he was about to unleash the end of civilization. It started with a simple mistake. A microscopic crack in a containment vial. He barely noticed it, only a faint hiss as pressure escaped. By the time the silent alarm detected the breach, it was already too late. Dr. Carter inhaled the airborne particles without a second thought, his body the first to host the virus that would bring the world to its knees. At first, it felt like the flu, mild fatigue, a dull headache. He barely acknowledged the symptoms as he went about his routine, reviewing reports, adjusting genome sequences. But then, the dizziness hit. The lab swam before his eyes. He staggered, gripping the edge of his workstation, his breaths coming fast and shallow. "Dr. Carter, are you all right?" his assistant, Marie, asked, concern etched on her face. "I just need some air," he mumbled. By the time he stumbled into the facility's break room, his skin had turned an unnatural shade of gray. His pupils were dilated, his veins bulging beneath the surface. The security footage would later show him convulsing, his limbs jerking uncontrollably before he collapsed against the cold, sterile floor. When the paramedics arrived, they found him unresponsive but breathing. His pulse was erratic, his skin clammy. They assumed it was a stroke, something treatable. They rushed him to the nearest hospital in a sealed ambulance, unaware that they were carrying the most infectious man on Earth. Within hours, Geneva's largest hospital became ground zero. Dr. Carter awoke screaming. His body twisted violently against the restraints as nurses attempted to calm him. His mind was gone, replaced by something primal, something insatiable. He tore through his restraints with inhuman strength, lunging at the nearest doctor. The first bite was messy. Teeth sank into soft flesh, tearing muscle from bone. Blood sprayed across the pristine white walls. The doctor's screams were drowned out by gurgling gasps as his throat was torn open. Panic swept through the hospital like wildfire. By the time security intervened, it was too late. Dr. Carter was already moving to his next victim, his hunger insatiable. The bitten doctor convulsed, his body spasming violently. Within minutes, his eyes turned a milky white, his mouth twisting into a grotesque grin. He rose to his feet with the jerky, unnatural movements of something no longer human. It was happening too fast. The virus, originally designed to adapt and replicate at an unprecedented rate, had mutated beyond control. The infected were no longer human within minutes, their bodies reshaped by the horror spreading through their veins. The hospital descended into chaos. Patients screamed, doctors ran for their lives. The security team opened fire, but the infected didn't feel pain. They kept coming, tearing into flesh, spreading the infection with every bite, every scratch. Within hours, Geneva was in turmoil. The streets overflowed with the dead and the dying. Authorities scrambled to contain the outbreak, shutting down borders, implementing emergency lockdowns. None of it worked. Because the virus had already spread. A flight had left Geneva that morning, carrying an American businessman who had been treated at the hospital's ER for a minor wound. He'd been bitten while trying to help an injured nurse. He dismissed it as nothing serious. A little painkiller, a quick bandage, and he was on his way home. By the time his plane landed in New York, he was already sweating, his skin pale and his eyes unfocused. 2 hours later, JFK International Airport became a bloodbath. The silent apocalypse had begun. The first emergency broadcast aired at 9:42 a.m. Eastern Time. This is an official government advisory. Citizens are urged to remain indoors. Do not attempt to travel. Repeat, do not attempt to travel. The situation is under control. It was a lie. By the time the message played across radio stations and news channels, the infection had already spread beyond containment. JFK International Airport, once a hub of human movement, was now a slaughterhouse. Security footage would later reveal how it started: a man stumbling out of Terminal 4, clutching his stomach, groaning in agony. A concerned flight attendant approached him, just in time for his jaw to unhinge and snap shut on her throat. The infected moved fast. Faster than anyone expected. Within minutes, screams echoed through the airport. Chaos erupted as passengers stampeded toward exits, only to be met by more infected lunging from every direction. The police arrived within 20 minutes, SWAT teams moving in with tactical precision. But bullets did little against the horde. The infected didn't feel pain. Headshots worked, but in the panic, officers missed more often than they hit. The bitten officers turned within minutes, turning their weapons on the living. By noon, JFK was lost. But it wasn't just New York. In Chicago, a hospital went dark, its last transmission a frantic nurse screaming before the line cut off. In Los Angeles, police barricades crumbled as hordes of infected stormed the streets. Cities across Europe, Asia, and South America reported similar outbreaks. The infection was everywhere. And it was winning. Washington, D.C., the White House Situation Room. President James Halstead stared at the screen in front of him, his face pale. Live footage from New York showed the impossible: mobs of people, no, not people, things, chasing, biting, ripping into the living. "This can't be real," he muttered. The room was filled with top officials, generals, intelligence directors, emergency response leaders, all speaking at once. "The infection rate is beyond anything we've seen. Estimated spread in major metropolitan areas is 78%, a grim-faced scientist interrupted. "At this rate, we lose New York within 4 hours. What about containment?" Halstead asked. General Douglas Nash, head of the Joint Chiefs, leaned forward. "We've mobilized the National Guard, but," he gestured at the screen, "where soldiers were already being overwhelmed, our men aren't trained for this." CIA Director Elise Turner added, "It's not just here. London, Paris, Beijing, Moscow, Tokyo, hell, even Sydney. It's global." President Halstead exhaled sharply. "Are we looking at bioterrorism?" Turner shook her head. "No group on Earth has the resources to deploy a virus like this worldwide in a single day." The realization settled over the room. This wasn't an attack. This wasn't a war they could fight with bombs or diplomacy. This was something else entirely. The world was losing. The streets of New York, 3:15 p.m. Chris Ramirez had seen bad days before. He was a paramedic, used to chaos. But nothing, compared to this. He and his partner, Dana, had been on a routine call when the city fell apart. They had picked up a woman suffering from what they thought was a seizure. She went into cardiac arrest mid-ride, and when Chris tried to resuscitate her, she woke up. Dana never stood a chance. Chris barely made it out of the ambulance alive, running through streets that had turned into a nightmare. He watched a father shove his family into a car, only for an infected woman to smash through the window and drag his screaming daughter out. He saw a cop firing blindly into a crowd, only to get tackled, screaming, as hands clawed at his flesh. He ran. He didn't know where. He just ran. The Pentagon, 5:45 p.m. Inside a fortified war room, General Nash made the call. "We have one last option: quarantine." President Halstead frowned. "Quarantine?" Nash's voice was grave. "Seal off the worst-hit cities. Military lockdown. No one in, no one out." The room fell silent. Homeland Security Secretary Linda Park spoke up. "Sir, that means bombing our own people." The president clenched his fists. A screen flickered. Live footage of Los Angeles. A military convoy had set up a perimeter, but the infected came too fast. Soldiers fired desperately, but the horde didn't stop. A moment later, screams filled the speakers as the camera went black. The line went dead. Nash looked at the president. "We don't have a choice." Halstead exhaled slowly. Then he gave the order. The night falls, 7:30 p.m. Explosions rocked the outskirts of New York and Chicago as targeted airstrikes wiped out bridges, tunnels, and highways. Entire neighborhoods were sacrificed. But it wasn't enough. The infected didn't just walk. They ran. And no wall, no barricade, no military strike could stop the tidal wave of the dead. By midnight, America was at war. And it was losing. The second emergency broadcast aired at 6:17 a.m. Eastern Time. "This is an official emergency alert. Martial law is now in effect. Remain in your homes. Trust only official sources of information. Help is on the way." Another lie. By dawn, Washington, D.C. was in ruins. The White House, 6:45 a.m. President James Halstead sat in the underground bunker beneath the White House, staring at a map filled with red markers. Each one represented a lost city. New York. Gone. Los Angeles. Gone. Chicago. Gone. The military's attempts at containment had failed. Cities that were supposed to hold out for days had fallen in hours. The virus was too fast, the infected too relentless. "Mr. President, we need to evacuate," General Nash said, his uniform stained with sweat. Halstead shook his head. "Evacuate where? There's nowhere left." The Secret Service had already abandoned their posts. Senior officials had fled. The vice president was missing. The Speaker of the House was confirmed dead. The chain of command was shattered. The United States government was dying, and Halstead knew it. The last broadcast from the CDC, 8:32 a.m. Dr. Evelyn Carter, lead virologist at the Centers for Disease Control, wiped the blood from her forehead. She wasn't sure if it was hers or someone else's. Her team was gone. The infection had breached the facility, and she had barely locked herself inside the broadcasting room in time. "This is Dr. Evelyn Carter," she said into the microphone, her voice trembling. "If anyone can hear this, do not approach major cities. Do not trust emergency shelters. The infection spreads through bites, but also," she hesitated. The truth was too terrifying to say aloud. "Also through the air in enclosed spaces. It mutates. Adapts. There is no cure." A loud bang echoed behind her. She turned just in time to see the door buckle under the weight of something slamming against it. "This is Dr. Carter. The world is not prepared for this. We." The door burst open. The camera caught a brief glimpse of her wide, horrified eyes before the screen went black. The CDC had fallen. The UN headquarters, Geneva, Switzerland, 11:15 a.m. The United Nations Security Council held an emergency meeting. It would be their last. Inside the underground chamber, diplomats and world leaders shouted over each other. "We must nuke the infected zones. You think radiation will stop them? The virus is everywhere. There is no stopping it." The arguing stopped when the first diplomat started coughing. A long, wet cough. Everyone turned. It was the Russian ambassador. His skin was pale, his forehead slick with sweat. He tried to speak, but then he convulsed, his chair toppling over as he hit the ground. For 3 seconds, there was stunned silence. Then he screamed. His body twisted unnaturally, his veins darkening as the virus consumed him from the inside out. His fingers clawed at the floor, his teeth grinding together as his mind shattered. Then he turned. The UN Security Council was wiped out within minutes. The cameras recorded it all. By noon, the United Nations had ceased to exist. London, Buckingham Palace, 1:07 p.m. A helicopter hovered over the burning city. Inside, King Edward VII stared down at his country. It was gone. London, once a beacon of civilization, was now a graveyard. The streets were filled with thousands of the infected, their bodies twitching as they feasted on the remains of the fallen. Smoke rose from the ruins of Parliament, and the River Thames ran dark with blood. His security chief spoke. "Your Majesty, we must leave. We have a bunker in Scotland." "Do you think it will matter?" the king asked, his voice hollow. The security chief had no answer. The helicopter turned north, leaving the city behind. It wouldn't matter. The fall of Washington, 3:30 p.m. The White House was under siege. The infected had overrun the city, swarming past crumbling barricades and abandoned military checkpoints. The last remaining Marines fought desperately, their bullets cutting down dozens, but for every one that fell, 5 more took their place. Inside the bunker, President Halstead gripped the phone. No one answered. No generals. No advisors. No military command. They were gone. He turned to General Nash, who sat against the cold steel wall, his breathing ragged. His sleeve was torn, his arm bleeding. "A bite mark." "Mr. President," Nash whispered. "It's over." Halstead closed his eyes. He picked up his pistol, took a deep breath, and ended his own presidency. Outside, the infected stormed the last stronghold of the free world. By nightfall, Washington, D.C. had fallen. The world goes dark, 6 p.m. All official broadcasts ceased. News stations went silent. Radios played only static. The internet collapsed. One by one, the lights of human civilization flickered out. The world belonged to the dead now. And they were still hungry. The third and final emergency broadcast aired at 10:22 a.m. Eastern Time. "This is a general distress call. If you can hear this, find shelter, trust no one. The government is. A scream. Then silence. The emergency channels went dark. The world had officially fallen. New York City, the last stand at Times Square. The soldiers knew they were going to die. Times Square had become a battlefield, littered with bodies, some human, most not. The remaining members of the National Guard had set up a last-ditch perimeter around the few survivors they had managed to evacuate. Civilians huddled behind overturned buses and makeshift barricades, their faces hollow with fear. Sergeant Luke Harris reloaded his rifle with shaking hands. His unit had been 20 men strong that morning. Now, it was just him, Corporal Diaz, and a handful of terrified civilians. A low, inhuman moan echoed through the ruined streets. The horde was coming. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of infected, their blood-stained mouths hanging open, their empty eyes fixed on the last remnants of the living. Some crawled, their bodies broken from earlier gunfire. Others sprinted, unervingly fast. Harris tightened his grip on his rifle. "Hold the line." Diaz opened fire first, mowing down the front row of the undead. The civilians scrambled to reload weapons stolen from fallen officers. They had little training, but desperation made them deadly. For a moment, it seemed like they were holding. Then the bullets ran out. The infected crashed into the barricades like a tidal wave, toppling buses and tearing through barbed wire. They ripped people apart before they could even scream. Harris grabbed Diaz and ran. They sprinted through the alleyways, past burning cars and abandoned stores. The screams faded behind them, replaced by the awful wet sound of flesh being devoured. They were the last 2 survivors of Times Square. And they had nowhere left to run. The highways of death. Millions tried to flee the cities. Highways became clogged with cars, desperate families trying to escape the nightmare behind them. It didn't matter. The infection was already ahead of them. In Florida, the I-95 was a graveyard of abandoned vehicles and half-eaten corpses. In Texas, entire convoys had been overrun, their remains still burning on the asphalt. In California, the Pacific Coast Highway was choked with the dead, their bodies swaying in the ocean breeze. There was no safe place left. No government. No military. No hope. Only survival. The raiders. With no law left, humanity turned on itself. At first, people helped one another, forming small communities, sharing supplies, protecting the weak. But as the days passed and resources dwindled, kindness was replaced by cruelty. Gangs formed, ruthless and violent. They didn't just kill to survive, they killed because they could. One of the worst was the Black Suns, a former paramilitary group that controlled what was left of the Midwest. They didn't just take food and weapons, they took people, enslaving them or using them as bait for the infected. In what used to be Denver, a mother begged them to spare her daughter. They laughed as they shot her in the head and dragged the girl away. In Louisiana, a group of survivors hiding in an abandoned hotel thought they were safe. The Black Suns found them at night. By morning, the hotel was a smoldering ruin, and its occupants had been nailed to the walls. The dead weren't the only monsters now. The underground survivors. Not everyone gave up. In the mountains of Montana, a former Navy SEAL named Marcus Kane gathered a group of survivors. He trained them, hardened them, turned them into fighters. In an old missile silo, a scientist named Dr. Emily Clark worked tirelessly, searching for a way to stop the virus. She was running out of time. In New York, Sergeant Luke Harris and Corporal Diaz stumbled upon a hidden bunker beneath an abandoned subway station. They weren't alone. A small community had formed, surviving underground, avoiding the horrors above. "We don't fight the dead," their leader, an old firefighter named Bill Carson, told them. "We avoid them. We outlast them." It wasn't much of a plan. But it was all they had. The evolution of the infected. Something was changing. At first, the infected were mindless. Just hunger and rage. But then, they started hunting differently. Survivors whispered about things moving in the shadows. About infected that didn't just attack, they waited. They watched. Some saw them communicate. Not with words, but with gestures, movements, signals. In Texas, a group of survivors vanished overnight. No screams. No gunfire. Just gone. The next morning, their camp was untouched, except for a single message, scrawled in blood on the wall. "We learn." No one knew what it meant. But they knew one thing. The dead were getting smarter. The future of humanity. The world was silent now. The cities, once full of life, were empty. The roads, once packed with people, were littered with bones. But in the darkness, humanity still fought. Some ran. Some hid. Some hunted back. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. The world belonged to the dead. But the living weren't finished yet. In the ruins of civilization, a new breed of survivor emerged, the hunters. They didn't run. They didn't hide. They fought. The hunt begins. Sergeant Luke Harris and Corporal Diaz had spent weeks underground in the hidden subway bunker beneath New York. The survivors there, led by Bill Carson, had stayed hidden, waiting for the dead to move on. But Harris knew the truth, the infected weren't leaving. They owned the city now. "We can't just sit here," he told Carson one night. "We need supplies. Weapons. Information. Carson shook his head. You go out there, you die. Harris didn't listen. Armed with makeshift weapons, a fire axe and a stolen police shotgun, he and Diaz crawled through an old maintenance tunnel and emerged into the ruins of Manhattan. The streets were eerily silent. Buildings stood like tombstones, their windows shattered, their insides gutted by fire and chaos. Then they saw them. Not just the roamers, the mindless infected that wandered aimlessly, but the hunters. The ones that waited. A group of them crouched near an overturned bus, their blank eyes locked onto something in the distance. They weren't moving, weren't attacking. They were observing. Jesus Christ, Diaz whispered. They're hunting in packs. Then one of them turned its head. Right at them. Run! Harris shouted. The chase was on. The road warriors. Across the country, survivors were banding together. But these weren't the helpless civilians from the first days of the outbreak. These were fighters, scavengers, killers. They called themselves the Road Warriors. Armed with salvaged military gear and modified vehicles, they roamed the wastelands, taking what they needed to survive. Some were ruthless, preying on the weak just as easily as the dead. Others still had a code, still remembered what it meant to be human. But all of them knew one thing: the world didn't belong to the weak anymore. The fall of the safe zones. For a while, people had clung to hope. The government had promised safe zones, secure areas protected by the military, where survivors could rebuild. That hope was dead now. In Colorado, Fort Carson fell in a single night. Witnesses claimed the infected didn't just attack, they organized. In Arizona, a survivor named Jake Mitchell sent out a desperate radio broadcast from Camp Verde. They're inside the walls. We don't know how. Oh God, there. The signal cut out. No safe zone lasted more than a week. The infected were getting smarter. The Black Suns strike again. The worst of humanity still walked the earth, and the Black Suns were among them. They weren't just raiders anymore. They were warlords, ruling over entire territories like kings of the apocalypse. In what used to be Kansas City, they turned a football stadium into a fortress, using captured survivors as bait to lure away infected. In New Mexico, they worked with the infected, setting traps, herding them toward rival survivor groups, then moving in to finish off whoever was left. They weren't just surviving. They were thriving. And they had one rule: obey. Or die. The scientists' last hope. Deep inside an abandoned military bunker in Montana, Dr. Emily Clark was running out of time. She had studied the virus from the beginning, watching as it mutated, adapted, learned. There had to be a weakness. Some survivors whispered that she was close to a cure. Others thought it was too late. Then, one night, her radio picked up a signal. A single phrase, repeated over and over. North. Follow the light. She didn't know who sent it. But she had nothing left to lose. The hunters become the hunted. Sergeant Harris and Diaz weren't the only ones fighting back. Across the country, others like them were rising up. In Texas, a former gang enforcer named Raul Cortez led a group of survivors who had learned how to trap the infected. In Oregon, a woman known only as Shadow used sniper rifles to pick off the smartest of the dead before they could learn too much. In Florida, an ex-firefighter named Travis Reed built flamethrowers to burn the horde down to ash. They weren't just surviving. They were hunting. And for the first time since the world ended, the dead were afraid. The next war. The world had fallen. But the war wasn't over. The infected had taken everything. Now, the survivors were coming to take it back. The war had changed. At first, it was the living against the dead. But now, it was something worse. The world wasn't just a battlefield, it was a chessboard. And the ones still playing weren't just survivors. They were predators. The Black Suns versus the Hunters. Sergeant Luke Harris and Corporal Diaz had returned to the subway bunker, but things had changed. Carson, the old firefighter leading the survivors, was gone, killed on a supply run. The new leader, a man named Derek Cole, had different ideas. "We need to make a deal," Cole said, his voice cold. "With the Black Suns." Harris nearly punched him. "They kill people," Harris snapped. "They sell them to the infected. And you want to negotiate?" Cole didn't flinch. "We're out of food. Out of medicine. You want to survive? You make deals." Diaz shook his head. "That's not survival. That's slavery." The argument didn't last long. That night, a signal flare shot up from the ruins of Manhattan. Then came the roar of engines. The Black Suns had arrived. And they weren't here to talk. The storming of the subway bunker. The first explosion rocked the tunnel walls, sending dust raining from the ceiling. The second blew open the barricaded entrance. The Black Suns didn't waste time. They flooded in with assault rifles, cutting down survivors before they could even grab their weapons. Those who ran were gunned down. Those who fought were outmatched. Harris and Diaz had one choice: fight or die. They chose to fight. From behind a collapsed train car, Diaz opened fire, taking down 3 Suns in seconds. Harris grabbed a fire axe and went for the ones trying to flank. It was chaos. Screams. Gunfire. Blood. Then, from deeper in the tunnels, something else. A sound. A low, guttural growl. Everyone, survivors and raiders alike, froze. Something else had entered the tunnels. Something new. The evolution of the dead. For weeks, survivors had whispered about them. The infected that weren't like the others. The ones that waited. That watched. Now, Harris saw one with his own eyes. It stood at the entrance of the tunnel, taller than the rest. Its skin was stretched tight over twisted muscle, its eyes black pits of hunger. It didn't stumble like the others. It stalked. Then it screamed. The sound was unnatural, high-pitched, vibrating through the air like a war cry. And then the horde came. They poured into the subway, moving with the Black Suns, around them, past them. But they didn't attack them. They attacked only the survivors. The truth hit Harris like a hammer. "They're working together," he whispered. Then the first survivor was torn apart. And the massacre began. The Montana stronghold. Dr. Emily Clark had heard the rumors. That the infected were changing. That they were organizing. Now, she had proof. Inside the Montana bunker, she analyzed a recent blood sample from an infected corpse. What she found made her stomach twist. The virus wasn't just mutating. It was networking. "This isn't a disease anymore," she whispered. "It's an intelligence." The infected weren't just eating. They were building something. But what? Then the power went out. And the screaming began. The rise of the warlords. Across what was left of America, new leaders were emerging. Some good. Most bad. The Black Suns weren't the only ones taking advantage of the chaos. In Texas, a man called the Judge ruled over Houston, executing anyone he deemed unworthy of survival. In California, a former billionaire named Malcolm Reese had turned a high-tech skyscraper into a fortress. He had power, resources, and his own private army. In the Midwest, a cult called the Red Dawn believed the infected were the next stage of evolution. They didn't fight them. They worshipped them. Humanity wasn't just fighting the dead anymore. It was fighting itself. The underground resistance. Not everyone gave up. The hunters were still out there. Luke Harris and Diaz barely escaped the subway massacre, finding refuge in an abandoned police station. But they weren't alone. Others had survived, too. A small but deadly group of fighters who had seen what Harris had seen. The infected were thinking. And they had to be stopped. "We take the fight to them," Harris said. "No more running. No more hiding. It was time to go to war. The final war begins." The world was broken. The dead ruled the cities. The warlords ruled the land. But the real battle was just beginning. The hunters were ready. The infected were waiting. And somewhere, in the ruins of America, the virus itself was watching. Waiting. Learning. Preparing. The world was already dead. But now, even the last scraps of civilization were burning. The war wasn't just between the living and the dead anymore. It was between who would control what was left. The last safe haven falls. Dr. Emily Clark had spent months in the Montana bunker, desperately searching for a way to stop the virus. Now, she was running for her life. The facility had been compromised. The Black Suns had come first, looking for weapons, supplies, and leverage. They had slaughtered most of the scientists, demanding Clark hand over her research. But before they could finish looting, they arrived. The infected. But not just any infected. The Alphas. They were bigger, stronger, smarter. And they didn't just attack randomly anymore. They had leaders now. Clark watched in horror as a tall, skeletal infected with glowing red eyes raised its arm, and the horde stopped moving. For the first time, the dead weren't just a mindless flood. They were an army. And the Alphas were its generals. The death of the Black Suns. The Montana bunker became a war zone. The Black Suns were ruthless killers, but they weren't ready for this. The Alphas didn't just charge in blindly, they coordinated. They cut off escape routes. They waited until the Black Suns ran out of ammo. They herded them into kill zones. By the time the last Black Sun screamed his final breath, the war was over. And the Alphas still weren't done. They wanted Dr. Clark. Because they knew she was the last one who could stop them. She ran. Alone. Through the snowy wilderness of Montana. And behind her, the dead followed. The signal from the north. For weeks, survivors had whispered about it. A radio signal, broadcasting from deep within the Arctic. Come north. The virus cannot survive the cold. There is still hope. Some believed it. Some didn't. Sergeant Luke Harris and his group of hunters didn't have a choice. With the Black Suns gone, the infected had no competition. They were spreading faster, consuming everything. So Harris made a decision. "We go north," he said. But getting there wouldn't be easy. Because between them and the Arctic were millions of infected. The Red Dawn's final sacrifice. Not everyone wanted to fight the dead. Some wanted to join them. The Red Dawn cult had always believed the infected were the next step in human evolution. But they had never had proof. Until now. Deep in Colorado, their leader, Father Gabriel, stood before a captured alpha. The creature didn't snarl or attack. It watched him. Studied him. And then, it spoke. Not words. But something else. A series of clicks and hisses, like an ancient language being reborn. Gabriel dropped to his knees. It wasn't a disease. It was a new species. And humanity was obsolete. The Red Dawn embraced their fate. They didn't resist when the infected came for them. They welcomed it. By morning, their compound was silent. Except for the sound of the Alphas whispering among themselves. Learning. Planning. Growing. The journey through hell. Harris and his hunters had one goal now: get to the Arctic. But the journey was impossible. The roads were overrun. Cities were burning. The infected weren't just wandering anymore. They were hunting. In Chicago, Harris's group walked straight into a trap. An Alpha had lured them in, using a fake distress signal. One of their own, Diaz, was dragged into the darkness, screaming as the horde swallowed him whole. Harris tried to save him. He failed. All he could do was run. And as he ran, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A voice. Low. Guttural. Coming from one of the infected. "We see you. The Arctic awaits." Dr. Clark had made it. Barely. Frozen, starving, she collapsed at the gates of an old military research station in the Arctic Circle. The last human stronghold. Scientists. Soldiers. Survivors. A place where the virus couldn't spread. Where humanity might still have a chance. As she looked up, she saw a group of men in heavy winter gear pull her inside. "You're safe now," one of them said. She wanted to believe him. But outside, beyond the walls, the storm was shifting. And in the snow-covered distance, a figure was standing. Watching. Waiting. The infected had never come this far north before. But now they had. And nothing would stop them. The world belonged to the dead. But the last of the living weren't going down without a fight. From the Arctic stronghold to the burning ruins of America, the final battle had begun. And this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about taking back the world. The siege of the Arctic. Dr. Emily Clark had barely escaped the massacre in Montana. Now, she stood inside the last human stronghold, an abandoned military base deep in the Arctic Circle. The virus couldn't survive the extreme cold. But something else had. Outside the walls, through the blinding snow, they were coming. The Alphas. Stronger. Smarter. Faster. And now, they were adapting to the cold. The survivors inside the base weren't ready. The last radio transmission sent a desperate message to anyone still listening. "This is Dr. Clark. We are under attack. If anyone is out there." Then static. The Arctic wasn't safe anymore. It was the last battlefield. And humanity was losing. The road to war. Sergeant Luke Harris and his hunters had made it farther north than anyone thought possible. They had lost people. They had seen horrors worse than death. But they weren't stopping now. They had intercepted Clark's message. And they were going to answer it. But getting to the Arctic base meant one thing: fighting through the largest horde the world had ever seen. The infected weren't just wandering mindlessly anymore. They had fortresses now. Entire cities ruled by the Alphas. The dead weren't just a plague. They were a civilization. And the hunters had to cut through the heart of it. The fall of Chicago. Harris's group pushed forward, straight into hell. Chicago had once been a city of millions. Now, it was a graveyard. Except the graves were walking. The Alphas had turned the ruins into a trap. The moment the hunters entered, the infected swarmed, moving like soldiers, flanking, surrounding, cutting off exits. Harris knew they wouldn't make it out. Not all of them. "Go," he ordered. "I'll hold them off." Diaz was already dead. Harris had nothing left to lose. So he made his last stand. Shotgun roaring. Axe swinging. Killing until there was nothing left of him. And as the horde consumed him, his last thought wasn't fear. It was hope. The others were still alive. And the fight wasn't over yet. The Arctic standoff. Dr. Clark and the last survivors stood on the frozen walls of the base, watching the blizzard rage outside. Then, through the snow, they came. Not just the infected. The Alphas. The rulers of the dead. And behind them, something worse. A creature larger than any before, its body a grotesque fusion of dozens of infected. A Titan. The virus had evolved into something new. Something unstoppable. Clark's voice was barely a whisper. God help us. Then the first explosion rocked the base. The siege had begun. The last of the hunters. The survivors were outnumbered 100 to 1. They had bullets, but the dead didn't stop. They had walls, but the Titan tore through them. Hope was gone. Until the sound of roaring engines. The last of the hunters had arrived. With stolen military vehicles. With explosives. With a plan. And they weren't here to hide. They were here to end this. The war ends here. The final battle was chaos. Gunfire cracked through the frozen air. Flamethrowers lit up the night. Explosives turned the battlefield into a firestorm. The Titan rampaged through the base, crushing men like insects, until the hunters brought it down with C4 and a direct hit from a stolen rocket launcher. The Alphas fought harder than ever, their intelligence almost human. But one by one, they fell. The dead had won the world. But the living refused to let it go. The end of the virus. Dr. Clark reached the research lab in the final moments of the battle. She had studied the virus for months. And now, she had one last chance to stop it. She activated the Arctic base's self-destruct sequence. Not just to destroy the infected, but to release an experimental airborne compound into the atmosphere, one designed to burn out the virus completely. It was unproven. It was dangerous. But there was no other choice. Harris had died to get them here. The world had one last shot. Clark hit the button. The explosion lit up the Arctic night. And with it, the virus began to die. The dawn of a new world. Days passed. Then weeks. Across the world, the infected began to weaken. Their bodies rejected the virus. Their hunger faded. The Alphas? They collapsed, one by one. The hunters watched as, for the first time in years, the world went silent. The apocalypse was over. And the survivors? They had won. The future belongs to the living. The world wasn't what it once was. Cities were still in ruins. Millions were still dead. But humanity had something it hadn't had in a long time. A future. Dr. Clark, now one of the last scientists alive, stepped onto the frozen tundra and watched the sun rise. It was a new world. A broken world. But it was theirs again. The age of the dead was over. Now, it was time to rebuild. The end, or the beginning? In the darkness of a collapsed underground lab, something stirred. A single heartbeat. A pair of glowing red eyes opened. And in the silence, a single whisper echoed. We are not finished.